live, YouTube, and live on Instagram. Let me take a breath. I get nervous. And then I end up doing what I notice a lot of people who work with me in peer counseling do, and even at the Eating Disorder Treatment Center. I end up talking way up here because I am not in my body. I'm all up in my head. So I'm going to take a breath. Feel free to take a breath with me. Come back down into your body. This is where recovery blossoms from recovery from an eating disorder. And I mostly deal with folks with anorexia and binge eating, compulsive exercise, and bulimia is often in there as well. My experience was bulimia with compulsive exercise. So it, there's different forms of bulimia. I don't want to get into the details of that too much, just to say that there's some forms of eating disorders like ARFID and in some forms of bulimia that I don't know so much about. All that to say, come back into your body with me as I do it so we're not up here and up here the whole time. And as the topic is today, an eating disorder recovery is not outside of you. And what I mean by that is somebody else doesn't have the answer for you. Something else doesn't have the answer for you. There may be things outside of you and people outside of you that can be helpful, that can say something or do something or produce something that resonates in your body, and you will experience that when you're in your body, because that's where you'll be able to have the reaction in your body and recognize in that moment through that feeling in your body that, ooh, this rings true for me. So ultimately, it always comes back to you. And I have a few stories about this that I think might be helpful from my own life and also from just listening to other people's stories. And I'll say more about this concept at the end so that it can be helpful. Because the first off, if you think of outstretched arms, someone once said this one time, and I found it very helpful. If you think of like outstretched arms, where you're just constantly reaching outside of yourself, if you're always walking around with outstretched arms, reaching outside of yourself for your recovery, or even that can imitate an eating disorder, reaching outside of yourself for your wholeness, for finding what you need, for your worthiness, for love. This is exhausting, even just all the time. Think about that, constantly outreaching. It's like me talking way up here when I'm not getting a breath in. Getting back and centered and bringing the arms back in gives us a break, gives us a chance to be with ourselves and experience and receive wisdom rather than always out here reaching, trying to get it. See if you can notice that difference. You have probably experienced both, and you can go back to your lived experience to get a body sense of the difference in what it feels like. One is exhausting and draining and life sucking, the other one is life producing and life giving. First example, many of you, actually, I don't know this, I'm making an assumption. Have you heard of ACT therapy? ACT. It stands for acceptance and commitment therapy. This is something that I have used a lot of in my own recovery. It's something that I use with peers. And I don't fully subscribe to everything about ACT therapy. In fact, I do have some gripes with its push towards doing and not very much about being. And it's pushed towards action and not very much about rest. While I understand that that can be helpful for some, for the folks that I work with, high achievers, very competitive people, always busy, always going, always doing, always producing, this does not speak to them or me. And one thing I noted was that, what was the thing? One thing I noted was that I was learning ACT, and parts of it were very, very helpful for me. And when I first questioned this part about doing, I thought, well, shoot, I mean, who am I to question years of science and research behind this method? Then the other day, I mentioned it to my therapist and I said, yeah, but I do have an issue with ACT because it really focuses on doing and on action. And she said, yeah. She said, and the creator, Stephen Hayes, he's on to something else now. He's doing something else now. And I looked it up. He's doing something called process based therapy and alternatives to diagnoses. And that really struck me because it illuminates the point I'm trying to make, which is that when you are going outside of yourself to find answers. So if I were to go, let me finish the thought. When you're going outside of yourself to find answers, all the things outside of yourself are also going to continue to evolve and go on their own journey. And if you are just trying to receive what they have or to follow along, it's never going to be as fulfilling and true to you as in trusting yourself. So the creator of ACT is on to something else. Yet there's lots of people that are taking classes in ACT, that are teaching it, that are using it in their practices, that are writing books about it. And yet he's on to something else, the original creator. So sit with that for a moment. If I hadn't have said what I said and was willing to see that, yeah, I like this, but there's parts of it that I'm not so much feeling, and I'm just following it along without ever questioning any part of it, then I actually don't get to live into the fullness of what my experience teaches me. And also that things change. So even something that's created will change, and people who create it will change. I'm having a struggle to explain this right now. I feel anxiety at that. And essentially, that you have something more profound and more expansive than any sort of clinical theory or psychological theory could have. So the popular ones are CBT, DBT, and ACT. All of those, also another thing that I have issue with about ACT, they pull from spiritual, not all of them, a couple of them pull from spiritual traditions, and one is very analytical and in the mind and about controlling thoughts. And in that way, they're taking from things without the full context of the spiritual tradition and things that they're taking from. And so, in that way, naturally, things are going to be missing. It's kind of like cultural appropriation. When you take something from a culture, this happens in the United States a lot with Black culture. When things are taken from Black culture out of context and imitated, what they lose is the spirit and the lived experience behind it. And they become, hi there, they become sterile. So when you take something out of the cultural context and you don't understand the full holistic picture of what's going on, it becomes very sterile, loses its spirit, and will not have the same effect for you. Okay, so with ACT, this is also what's going on because it's also pulling from spiritual traditions. The way it helped me was because I took note and I went back and looked at the spiritual traditions that it was pulling from. And that's when I really started to understand how these practices could be helpful because it was in the greater context of spiritual tradition, connection, and real lived experience. All right, another example. I'm going to go to my notes here. Another example. Oh, here's another example. I talked about this in my stories the other day, which was for me when I had championship races in cross country and track. I would train so hard during the year and not be consuming enough and getting enough rest and be really also probably studying a lot or working a lot and just be drained by the time I get to the championship season. And so then I would be burnt out and I would never perform up to my capability. Well, when that happened, I would get really, really down on myself and I would have the instant thought, I need to work harder. I'm not doing enough. I need to work harder. All outside of myself, instead of listening to my body, which was burnt out coming back into it, getting grounded, and allowing myself to have rest. Instead of doing that, which would open me to the discomfort of not performing to my ability and my expectation, which would bring up a lot of anxiety, instead I would just jump right into training harder and more. And you can see how that cycle just grinds away and grinds somebody down. This is the same thing that can happen with an eating disorder. And in fact, if you're an athlete and you have an eating disorder, they can intersect to where if you have a performance, like in this case, I'm talking about championship races, if you have a performance where you don't perform well, you can also have the thought, oh, it's because of what I'm eating. And then you can start trying to manipulate and control that even more instead of sitting with the discomfort and allowing the wisdom that you already have in here to let you know what you actually need to do in the moment. Instead, we're going straight up to here into our old patterns of not good enough, not enough, and we're jumping straight into action of gotta manipulate my food or gotta train harder. The first one is going outside of ourself, not willing to be centered and be with ourselves and pay attention to the wisdom, creates burnout, creates um, life draining, life sucking out of the body. The other one, which would be to just be with what is coming up and noticing that I'm tired, I'm exhausted, and I feel uncomfortable. Being with that feeling it's hard to explain, especially it has to be experienced. Being with that feeling allows it to move and transform, and wisdom actually comes out of that you will sense through the body, and then you will actually know what is needed, as opposed to thinking your way through it with your old thought patterns running on repeat and then doing what you've always done and repeating the cycle, causing more harm and more harm and more harm and more harm. So that's the second example. Third example, man, I don't know, this is too much to get into one video probably. Wrist injuries is something that I'm dealing with right now. Okay. I have a history, like I said, I have foot injury and I have a history of wrist injuries. And this week they were I don't know what the word is, but they're re-aggravated. I'll just say that for now, re-aggravated. And so now I can barely do anything without my wrist starting to hurt. And I know that if that keeps going, I won't be able to do anything, including typing, including doing my job, including cleaning my apartment, like just basic stuff. Can't do. And that's scary. So as soon as that started happening, I started noticing my thoughts were going rapid fire of like, okay, you need to find another job. Okay, you're going to have to really reduce your expenses. Maybe you're going to have to rent out your office. All these thoughts were coming and coming and coming. Now, because I have some practice, I was able to, in the moment, notice what was happening, come back into my body, notice there was a lot of anxiety going on there. There was anger too at the fact that it was happening, and that I was able to just allow that all to be there and have compassion for myself and my experience. So all of that was happening, but it was held in this warm, loving blanket that this is my experience and it is valid. So one is I could go outside of myself, which I was doing. I was getting caught up in my thoughts of, I got to do this. I got to do this now. I got to sell this. I got to reduce this. I got to blah, 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 planning and doing. And then the other one was being with myself, which is, let me just hold all of this that is happening with the most compassion and self-kindness that I can. Oh, yeah. Okay, this is what I was reading my own notes here. Another thing is about when life stops you. And I mentioned this in my stories too, as well. Sometimes life will stop you. Yes, you might have caused it, but at this point, like with injuries stopped me from doing what I wanted to do. It wasn't my choice. I got stopped. So when that happens, especially when it's physical things and you can now no longer rely on the physical things outside of yourself that you were relying on to keep you safe and comforted, it can be an opportunity to go more inward because everywhere outward is breaking down. Physical form is breaking down. And those can be very, very scary moments if we have really, really attached ourselves to physical form. And they can be opportunities as well to find something different, which is going inward and connecting with your essence, your spirit, your consciousness, and finding that this is where you actually feel at home, centered, grounded, and that this is where you get safety and security because this doesn't break down. All this other stuff outside of us does. Impermanence. Everything ends and then re-begins at a certain point. So all of these examples so far, you can look at how even if we take ACT therapy, impermanence, the creator is already on to something else. Impermanence. And that anything can be an opportunity to go inward. We always have that opportunity. That can never be taken from us, which is quite profound, and why this is actually a very important base to your recovery from an eating disorder. And that, in my opinion, eating disorder recovery is a spiritual process. It is a spiritual practice. And when it is devoid of spirit, it is often unsustainable and very much like we talked about at the beginning, the outstretching and reaching. Last example was I was listening to Democracy Now! This morning, and they were playing clips from Spike Lee at the Shabazz Center in New York. And it was a commemoration of Malcolm X's birthday because it was May 19th. And Malcolm X would have been 98 years old. And Spike Lee was talking about producing the film Malcolm X. And he was telling the story of how he ran out of money. He put half his salary into the movie and he was running out of money. And Warner Brothers was not funding it. I don't know what the agreement was at the beginning, but they were like, no, you can't fund it. It's too long, blah, 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 blah. But then they also had like a JFK documentary that was 3 hours long. But they were saying, no, you can't make this Malcolm X documentary. It's too long, this, that, and the other. So Spike Lee was like, I got to find a way. And he was hearkening back to what Malcolm X would say, which is about self-reliance. And so he thought, okay, I know there's some rich Black folks that could fund this movie. And he started reaching out to them. I mean, it was a funny story. He's talking about it. I recommend that you listen to the Democracy Now! Clip of this. It's pretty good. Or even the Shabazz Center. If you go to their website, they have the whole thing. It's like 3 hours long. You can watch it. It's like a YouTube video. And the key things that he says that was really interesting to me was that he talks about that, one, don't let them determine your worth. So I don't know if he was referring specifically, I mean, it's a broad statement, and I don't know specifically, it sounded like he was referring to his film. He had faith in his film, in his work, in the actors and actresses that were working with him, and that he was going to find a way to make it happen. So that's one. With eating disorder recovery, same thing. Never let somebody else outside of you determine your worth. And really the only way to understand that is to be in with yourself. Because in eating disorder recovery, as you go along, people are going to have theories and they're going to have their perspectives, just like I have right now. And it might not line up with your lived experience. And it will be up to you and only you in that moment to honor that your experience is valid. Have people that support you in this, because you can find that. But even those people might not know your exact experience, and it's going to be up to you to trust that your experience is valid and to never let anybody else determine your worth and what you have and what the expansiveness that you have and that you bring. And the second thing he said was that Denzel Washington in the film took a year to prepare for playing the role of Malcolm X and really studied Malcolm X and his life. And he said that one day after filming, I don't know what scene it was, that he went up and he said Malcolm's eyes. Oh, he said Malcolm. He said, I'm sorry, Denzel Washington was playing the role and he was going beyond the script. So the script, his lines had ended, but he was so in character and the spirit was coming through him that he was able to go on in a profound way, and that they were able to use for the film because it was so impactful and really conveyed Malcolm X in the film. But it wasn't scripted. And he said, Spike Lee said when he approached him afterwards, he says Malcolm eyes were glazed over. And he said it was truly the spirit of Malcolm X that was working through him, because he was, I don't know, I'm making an assumption now that he was open and that he was so in character with the spirit of Malcolm X. And so again, this goes back to what I'm talking about, which is it's not outside of you. It is only through here that you're going to connect with what is important and what you need to recover from an eating disorder. And that if it's devoid of your spirit, it will never be sustainable for you and it will never feel like home. It will never feel grounded. It will never feel empowering if it's not centered in your spirit, in your beingness. That's what I have today. Eating disorder recovery is not outside of yourself. It never will be. It never will be. All those things outside of yourself, including your physical body, will deteriorate at some point. They will change. Change is a constant. The one thing that you always have is your spirit is inside of you. And the more you can get in touch with that, the more you will know what you need to do, if you actually have to do anything, in order to thrive, to let go of disordered eating as a mechanism to keep yourself safe and to show up in the world in alignment with your purpose. It's in here. It is not out there, and it never has been. Nobody's here, so if you have questions, you can leave them. You can DM me. All right. Enjoy your Sunday.